You are with the British Museum, and just wanted to let you introduce yourself in terms of your involvement with the radiocarbon dating recently of the Shroud of Turin.
Well, I'm keeper of the British Museum Research Laboratory, and the museum was asked to help in the coordination of the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud. I'm first of all to provide the control samples which were to be dated along with the Shroud, then to help in the distribution of the samples to the laboratories, and finally to receive in the results of the dating results from the three laboratories to carry out the statistical analysis.
I think one of the most important questions that is going to arise from this conference is how do we at this point reconcile an apparent medieval date for the Shroud and with what appears to be an abundance of evidence, iconographic, historical, physiological, and otherwise, that suggests at least authenticity. So let me just have you answer that as best as you can.
Trying to answer it, I should first of all say I'm not an expert on the iconography or the other aspects of the Shroud, nor in fact am I particularly well informed of the other work of the Shroud. I mean, I've read Ian Wilson's book, I've read some scientific papers, and I've attended parts of the conference here. Those parts I've been able to attend without giving interviews. But as far as the iconography is concerned, I'm not really prepared to comment on that. But as far as the other scientific data is concerned, I'm not really convinced that the medieval date for the Shroud is inconsistent with this. I mean, if, for example, one takes the pollen data, which shows that the Shroud was at some time in Jerusalem or in that area, I mean, that's perfectly possible that the Shroud originated there and then came to France in the Middle Ages. If one looks at the creation of the image, which is really the main problem, how the image was formed, again, I'm not certain why it's more difficult to explain the image formation if it's 14th century and medieval than it is if it's of the period of Christ. You still have a very real problem. I mean, it's my view that a body was involved in some way or another because of its three-dimensional nature. But I'm not really convinced, unless one falls back on some supernatural event occurring associated with the resurrection and producing the image, unless one falls back on that, then I don't see there's any greater difficulty explaining an image created on a cloth in the Middle Ages as compared with one in the period of Christ.
Understand that you are not claiming to be an expert in iconography or history, blood chemistry, or many of the other, or image formation or other areas of Shroud research. However, there appears to be, in talking to many of the attendees of this conference, that there is a feeling that C14 has spoken. The Shroud is therefore absolutely medieval, and therefore all of the rest of the evidence must therefore be reconciled with an absolute medieval date. That appears to be at least how many of the attendees are perceiving the results of C14. And of course the converse can be asked, why is it then, or even is it, the burden to adjust or the rest of the evidence to accommodate C14, or is it perhaps just as reasonable to suggest that C14 itself must be readdressed in the light of the rest of the body of evidence?
I think the first point to make really is that C14 is the only method that specifically provides you with a date for the Shroud. None of the other methods or techniques are actually providing a date. You can infer a date from the results obtained, but none of them provide you with an absolute date. And that is why one sees C14 as different from all the other techniques. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the date we've attained must be right. I mean, I am convinced that the date we've attained is valid. One's done all the checks that one always does on C14, rather more checks than one normally does. One's done, as well as the Shroud, comparable linen samples spanning a 1400-year period, and the three laboratories got correct dates for those. Therefore, it makes one believe that the shroud date the date they got for the shroud is also correct. I suppose, without wanting to appear too arrogant, I do see it's the responsibility of someone else to tell us why our C14 date is incorrect, rather than saying they must adjust their evidence accordingly. But if they cannot say why that date is incorrect, then, I mean, one does have to consider adjusting the other evidence. But the difference between C14 and anything else is the only method that provides you with an actual date.
I think the one question that comes to mind regarding C14, in particularly with the sample that was taken and the location of that sample, the one thing that appears to be troublesome is the fact that the sample site was from an area of the shroud which was in an obvious water stain, and an area where water collected on the shroud during the fire in 1532. We know that the cloth and perhaps the water itself would have been heated to a high degree of temperature, and this leaves some to speculate that this would have created an environment ripe for isotope exchange or other things which could have created an error in the C14 dating. So let me just have you answer that.
First of all, one should say that the area from which one took the sample for radiocarbon dating was clearly restricted to somewhere on the edge or side in order to minimize the damage to the shroud. So one was almost obliged to take it from one of the four corners. And one took it from the corner from which a sample had already been removed. And that was the judgment of Turin, which was perfectly valid and perfectly acceptable to the laboratories. It certainly wasn't a charred area. I'm not certain myself what the evidence, I accept probably, without knowing, having looked or remembering the area in detail, there could well be water staining as in other parts. I'm not certain what the evidence for any superheating is and what exactly one means by superheating without producing any charring. But I mean, certainly if there's just water, I can see no way that that is going to provide significant contamination of the sample. In that one would need a very large amount of contamination. I mean, more than 50% of the carbon would have to be contamination of a sort of 18th, 19th century in order for it to produce a medieval date as opposed to a date of a period of Christ. Isotopic exchange, I mean, I don't think is feasible. I know of no sort of evidence or mechanism for this occurring in a cloth which remains integral. I mean, if it had vaporized, then yes, things could happen. But it remained an integral bit of cloth. It might have got wet, it might have got hot, but I don't think there's any mechanism available for isotopic exchange. And I certainly don't think there's any possibility of contamination from the water or anything else in that area to the extent that would be necessary to produce a change from 2,000 years ago to about 600 years ago. You want about 50%. I mean, I think it is possible that the fact that the dates of a shroud show slightly greater dispersion than the dates of the other samples could perhaps reflect that the shroud was slightly more contaminated, but that still doesn't give you any possibility of pushing the date back from the Middle Ages through to the period of Christ.
There may be a desire on the part of scientists and the church, the officials in Turin and the Pope to do more research because of the nature of the shroud is controversial, and because we do have this apparent conflict between the C14 dating results and what we have mentioned before is the other body of evidence which seems to contradict that. How would you feel if it was requested to do additional dating on the shroud?
Well, I mean, assuming there wasn't a request for additional dating, I mean, this would have to come, first of all, from Turin, and in reality, they have never requested dating of the shroud. As they quite rightly say, it was the laboratories who made the offer to them to date the shroud. So I think it's extremely unlikely that they would ever ask anyone to redate the shroud. They didn't in the first instance. I see no reason why they should ask anyone to do it now. But I mean, assuming that somebody persuaded Turin to provide other samples, then I would imagine that there would be laboratories who would be willing to date them. But I couldn't be. I mean, we would not be able to date them at the British Museum. So I can't say whether we would date them because we couldn't date them. We use conventional radiocarbon dating with a large sample. And I can't really answer for other laboratories, but I suspect if somebody persuaded Turin to provide additional samples, then I suspect there'd be laboratories who'd be happy to date them, and I would have no objections. As you say, it's an important sample, and a few more dates at a subsequent time or from a different area would be more valuable. I had always felt that to have 7 laboratories in the first instance was extremely wasteful, and it would be far more sensible to have 2 or 3 as we had, with the possibility of further dates subsequently if this became necessary. I don't say it is necessary myself, but you know, if people could persuade Turin that one should date from another area, then I would certainly have no objections.
In the Nature report, there was just a bar note or so of the rogue sample that had been sent to Precision Textile in Derbyshire. In the December Textile Horizons, 88, they mentioned that and said that that piece of cotton had been identified as quite ancient and probably Egyptian. How it got there, Mr. South made no comment about it. It was only about a 2-paragraph thing or so. During the course of this conference, we have had, though it was never pursued, an obvious difference of opinion among textile persons. Ray is claiming that there are 2 different kinds of cloth there, one with cotton, and Vial and others saying that it is all of one kind. But none of the laboratories, to my knowledge, made any textile analysis before it was reduced to the carbon pellet, checking the text size of the threads or anything else.
No, I mean, I think all the laboratories took a photographic record of the thing, and they all looked at it carefully under the microscope for extraneous matter. Right. And I assume that thread of cotton which was found was not a rogue sample, but a piece of extraneous matter which was adhering to the cloth. Right. And it was removed and sent for identification. I haven't actually seen the report. There is a report on that, is there?
Well, I have not seen the report, only the Textile Horizons, the article that appeared in there, which was no more than 4 or 5 paragraphs.
Yes, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen that, in fact.
But the reason I asked about that is when Wilson wrote his first book, pages 70 to 72 in the American edition quote Ray's and pointing out the difference in text size or the difference of diameter of the threads.
Yes.
And a claim that cotton was wound in herbaceum to the threads, I thought, of the main body, and that it was non-extant, in quotes, the side strip. The second thing was that all 3 labs were in agreement that there was very little contamination. All of us, I think, know that you can negate the contamination issue, that it would take, what, 60% of market contaminants?
Well, I mean, yes, 60%.
A rather high figure.
Yes, a high figure.
But in talking to one of the scientists in America, he said, well, if the Italian Commission, 69-73, found a high degree of contamination, if Libby apparently, when it was first discussed with him, was leery of it, because of that date, so far back, where you all have made geometric leaps forward in cleansing, but that he was worried. But this fellow at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory said, no, but you know what is interesting is you would expect less contamination on a newer piece of cloth than you would on the main body if there were a difference between the 2.
Well, I think there's no doubt that the sample came from the main body of the Shroud. And as far as I'm aware, I mean, it was looked at by the textile experts, both Professor Vial and Testori there. I don't think they didn't, you should ask them, but I don't think they identified any cotton. You'd see that at the microscope.
It said that when Testori looked at it, and the side wound was pointed out to him, he asked what was that, which did not raise the confidence level of Shroud students that he knew very much about what he was looking at.
But I mean, Professor Vial is in fact the person who is much more conversant with looking at ancient textiles, and is a world expert on it. I mean, he looked at it, which is why we had these people along. And I mean, he would have said if there was a lot of cotton wound round it, I think.
Canadians and others, and maybe even the British Museum and all three laboratories that were involved, I remember reading a few years ago that they had carbon-dated micro samples of blood. I believe they took them from arrowheads and other things, known dated weapons.
Yeah, that's right,
so they had a confirmatory thing on the blood and were able to date the blood. One of the things in the Shroud study is there are little burn holes that we see that are prior to the 1532 fire. They show up in the drawing at Beer in Belgium. They're also in a Hungarian Prey manuscript dating 1192 to 1195. Rogers and Schwalbe, at the time of the 78 examination, thought that it was a pitch blende or possibly an incense, something that dropped out of a censer at that time. Would it be possible to date the incrustation that is still on those holes to get an idea of the date of the incense or the pitch blende?
I mean, it depends on whether the blackness is actually the incrustation or whether burnt cloth.
Right.
And if it was the incrustation, in principle, it's a matter of getting enough. And I mean, you do need a few milligrams. I mean,
50 or what?
No, you don't need 50 because that's enough to do several measurements, as they did on the Shroud sample. But you need 5 to 10, I think.
The analysis would have to proceed to determine if it were just a burn.
But I think pitch. I mean, if it's pitch, I think that has a sort of an infinite age, doesn't it? Isn't it like oil?
But what about if it were, God knows what it is?
Well, I mean, if it's some organic material from a recent plant.
From the incense.
Yeah, well, incense, what is incense?
I'm not sure.
That's some wood, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that would, you could date that.
Some resin, I had
yes.
thought.
Well, that's, so that would date from the, so that would be of the date when it went on. But if it was pitch, it would be, I think pitch is like oil and therefore several 100,000 years old. So you get an infinite age.
The unresolved thing about that, I would think that those who have tried to look at it seriously and like yours truly still believe there's something amiss.
Yes.
Who make no argument against the date that was achieved or the integrity of the laboratories, that believe both were copacetic.
Yeah, well, quite. And the thing is, the C-14 provides a date, which is much more difficult to argue against.
But because of what we would call the preponderance of evidence from other fields, the question then becomes, what does science do when it is in conflict, seemingly in conflict with itself? Damon told me that he and I believe Hall, and with all due respect to him who has succeeded, has made some rather asinine statements about the Shroud.
Oh, well, he is his own man.
Yes, but I mean not obviously showing that he's a tyro when it comes to syndronological knowledge.
Yes, and to anything. I mean, he says what he wants to, what he would like to on everything.
But Damon said, and we saw it, I think, on the videotape yesterday, looking under glass at the image, and he said, both Hall and I were convinced that there is no way it could be a painting.
Oh, yes, no, I mean, I'm sure
what
it's not a painting.
Wolfley has said
Yeah, no, I'm
but,
sure it can't be a painting.
But Paul said that to me by telephone.
Yeah.
So it is some kind of dehydration.
Yes,
the only way that I can figure out that if one day I must yield, and I would hope I would be pseudo-empiricist enough to say if it's all in, I would have to say that. The only thing that makes sense to me that it could be from the Middle Ages is if there were the custom crucifixion.
Yeah.
That would account for the human blood and all the rest of the things.
Yeah.
However, the problem there is with the coins, one, that you would have to know that they were there and be able to obtain them in the Middle Ages. Two, the width of the wound between the fifth and the sixth ribs is 1.58 centimeters, the exact width of a first century Roman pilum. So you would have to have an exact replica and or a museum piece to accomplish that. Then the American microscopist, and I guess he's a crystallographer, Kolbeck, who works for Atlas, Hercules Atlas in Salt Lake City, took some of the dirt samples that had been found on the tip of the nose, the knee, and the feet. And it turned out to be a calcite, but a very rare form of calcite, travertine aragonite, as it was. And he said, well, this has the same spectral properties as the travertine aragonite from the cave tombs near the Witch Gate at Jerusalem, not St. Stephen's. To verify that, they sent it on to the Enrico Fermi Institute. And Dr. Levisetti there, not knowing what the sample was, ran it through his electronic scanning microprobe, which was, I think, the best tool we had in our country at that time. And he verified that it was the travertine aragonite with virtually the same spectral properties. The question is, again, where would a medieval forger...
Not quite, but I mean, I just, at that point, I mean, I just don't believe, as my knowledge of provenance in archaeological material, that you can be that certain about a small particles of travertine.
No.
You can always make a positive statement, but it's consistent with the travertine in that cave, but you can never say that there's no other travertine which would match it.
That is it. But
that's the thing.
Coincidence that a medieval European could find that.
Oh yes, no, I mean he wouldn't find it. He wouldn't find it and get it. I must have gone on by chance, and probably from somewhere else.
Yeah, but in the foot areas, you see, right where the man
walked
in the, these are the kinds of things that still leave the door open, because what I am trying to avoid, and I don't know how it can be done, is the church. I'm Anglican, not Roman, so I am a skeptic. Johnny come lately to this thing only for 10 years, like the late Bishop Robinson. I came to scoff and stayed to pray. But when you have all these things together, the church obviously was afraid, and Ballestero, they'd been through Galileo once. They didn't want to appear like the Flat Earth Society. So he said, all right, I accept the date. Can understand that. On the other hand, I don't think you have to be a religious fanatic to say, I still believe it's real. And how do we say, well, maintaining the integrity of the labs and all of those who are involved in it, and say there is still something more that is here. I think it's unfair to ask you fellows to say, all right, will you tell us how the image was made?
Well, quite,
but
quite.
It is,
it's, there's still a problem. No.
But it nevertheless is a real question.
Yes.
That somebody has to deal with. And what I'm looking for is how can both camps have respect for one another, while to me it is still an open-ended question. While not debating the date
No, I take your point. It is. Well, that's why I'm here. It's trying to maintain discussion and respect. It's been a bit difficult at times. Not all the time, but just at times. You're recording that, are you?
just don't make statements like Dr. Hall. Somebody said, the only thing thicker than his ego is the London fog in which he swirls. But
he's his own man.
Well,
I'll be sure to send him a copy of this.
Well, no, I would say this to his face. I'm saying, I can acknowledge, just like Macron, I think he has a wonderful knowledge as a microscopist, but his a priori decision of what it is skewed his interpretation of what he is seeing. And there are many other microscopists who do not agree with him. But his reputation is so huge that it has a valence that carries more weight than it should in this particular case.
Right. Well, can I get back in?
Thank you, Dr. Tite. Thank you very much.
Right, you are? Okay, pleasure.